you're listening to this, then brace yourself, because what you're about to hear is something the Habsburgs never wanted the world to know. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to History 1 so you never miss the next terrifying hidden chapter buried beneath the grand palaces of Europe. Now, they say the dead speak only in whispers, but in the vaulted underbelly of Vienna's oldest imperial crypt, the dead scream. For centuries, the Capuchin crypt has been the resting place of emperors, empresses, and princes, marble-faced symbols of power whose portraits fill history books with their stiff postures and elegant clothes. But official portraits lie. They always have. And deep beneath the polished sarcophagi, behind a sealed iron gate that was never meant to be opened again, lies a forgotten chamber that contains the Habsburgs' most disturbing secret. A row of tiny coffins that were never recorded, never blessed, and never supposed to be found. This story begins with a discovery made not by historians or archaeologists, but by accident. The year was 1889, a time when empires trembled beneath whispers of revolution, and the old world groaned under the weight of its own traditions. Repairs were underway inside the imperial crypt after a section of the ceiling had begun to crack. A mason named Joseph Kaltner was working in the lowest chamber when he noticed something odd. A narrow seam in the wall behind one of the immense bronze sarcophagi. It should have been smooth stone, but instead it rang hollow when tapped. Joseph was no aristocrat. He was a labourer, a man who had spent his life carving stone for the very monarchy that would never acknowledge his existence. But he was also curious, fatally curious, as some would later say. That night, after the supervisors had left, he returned with a lantern and a chisel. It took him nearly 3 hours to loosen the slab, his breath echoing in the cold, stale air. And then, with a final crack, the stone shifted inward. A breeze flowed out, ancient, damp, and faintly sweet, like decayed flowers. Joseph lifted the lantern and crawled inside. The chamber was small, no more than the size of a peasant's cottage kitchen. The ceiling was low and arched, thick with centuries of dust. Along the far wall stood 7 wooden coffins, tiny, no longer than a man's forearm. They were arranged in a perfect row. No labels, no royal crests, no dates, just silence. Joseph felt something tighten in his throat. In centuries of working among the bones of emperors, nothing had ever unnerved him like this. He reached out, touching the lid of the nearest coffin. The wood was dry, brittle, like the timber of a forgotten barn. A gentle push was all it took for the lid to shift. The lantern light flickered as he leaned over and looked inside. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth. Then the shape became clearer. A child? No, an infant. But with features so distorted that Joseph recoiled. The skull was elongated, the jaw twisted into a sharp curve, the eye sockets uneven and cavernous. The tiny limbs were curled tightly, the fingers fused like wax left too close to a flame. He staggered back, barely catching the lantern before it dropped. He should have run. He should have sealed the wall and pretended he had never seen anything. But Joseph was human, too human. The need to understand, the need to confirm what his mind refused to believe, pulled him toward the second coffin, and the third, and the fourth. Each contained a child, each more deformed than the last. Some had no recognizable faces at all, only smooth stretches of bone where features should have been. One had a skull 3 times the size of a normal infant's, the ribs protruding like tiny branches. Another seemed to have 2 entwined spines, like twins that had tried to become one but failed halfway through. By the 7th coffin, Joseph was shaking. He finally fled the crypt, dropping his tools behind him as if they had turned red hot. When he emerged into the cold Viennese night, he vomited in the street. He never went back. He never spoke of it publicly. But the Habsburgs knew. Oh, they knew. And the secret he uncovered would haunt the monarchy for decades. Joseph Kaltner vanished from history just as quietly as he lived. No newspaper ever reported his story. No archive ever preserved his name. But the imperial household reacted swiftly, far too swiftly for it to have been mere rumour. The morning after Joseph fled the crypt, 2 Capuchin monks found traces of disturbed dust leading to the sealed wall, a missing slab, a lantern soot mark on the arch, and in the corridor outside, a single small shoe print in dried mud. Josef's. Within hours, the palace had dispatched officials from the Obersthofmeisteramt, the imperial court administration. These men were not police, though they carried the authority of men who could erase lives with a signature. They descended into the crypt long before the public opening hours. No prayers were spoken for the dead that morning. 2 guards later whispered that the officials broke into a run the moment they saw the open chamber. One of the monks overheard a trembling voice say, "Again? After all these years?" The discovery was immediately classified. The chamber was resealed with fresh limestone. Josef was quietly dismissed from imperial service and given a small monetary compensation that forced him into silence. The man died 3 years later, supposedly of pneumonia, but locals in his neighbourhood said he never again slept a full night, and that some evenings he woke screaming about the tiny faces in the dark. But here's the question that haunted Vienna's underbelly. Why did the Habsburgs have a secret crypt for malformed infants? To answer that, we must step back, far back, into the tangled branches of Europe's most inbred dynasty. For centuries, the Habsburgs clung to a philosophy that would destroy them from within. Let others wage war. You, lucky Austria, marry. The phrase was more prophecy than proverb. Archdukes married nieces, emperors married cousins, bloodlines twisted into knots so tight that the same ancestral faces re-emerged generation after generation, sometimes beautiful, sometimes grotesquely exaggerated. The famous Habsburg jaw, seen in countless portraits, was only the beginning. Behind palace curtains, far from the eyes of painters and visiting dignitaries, darker consequences took shape. Stillborn heirs, infants with spines that folded like paper, children born with fused skulls, webbed limbs, or organs arranged in impossible ways. In a world where royal blood was supposed to be divine, such anomalies were unacceptable, unthinkable, unshowable. So, the dynasty developed rituals of concealment. Midwives who delivered malformed infants were sworn to secrecy with threats of exile or worse. Priests assigned to the court were instructed never to record certain baptisms or burials. The bodies were placed in hidden vaults, occasionally cremated in secret furnaces. Anything to protect the image of a dynasty chosen by God to rule. But not all the children were stillborn. Some lived, briefly. And those were the ones that troubled the empire most. Your average peasant could give birth to a deformed child without consequence. The village priest would merely sigh and chalk it up to fate or illness. But when the child of an emperor was born with a face warped beyond recognition, it could shake the legitimacy of the entire monarchy. Rumours circulated through the servant corridors of Schönbrunn Palace and the Hofburg. They told of muffled cries from behind locked nursery doors, of wet nurses dismissed after a single night, of royal physicians who aged prematurely from the strain of keeping impossible secrets. In 1771, a chambermaid wrote in a private letter that one of Empress Maria Theresa's grandchildren was born, with a head as large as a pumpkin and with eyes that never fully closed. The child lived for 11 days, during which the palace curtains remained drawn. That child was never entered into the imperial genealogies, and so many others were erased the same way. But the 7 infants found by Josef in 1889 were different. Their coffins were old, far older than Joseph's time. Some estimated they belonged to the early 1700s, maybe even the late 1600s. That meant someone, generations earlier, had built that secret chamber intentionally. The coffins were arranged too deliberately, too ceremonially. This was not accidental concealment. This was a pattern, a ritual, maybe even a tradition. When word of Joseph's discovery reached the upper echelons of the court, panic rippled through the imperial family. Some feared scandal, others feared something far worse, that the deformities were not only a result of inbreeding, but perhaps a curse, a family curse older than the empire itself. And behind velvet curtains, in a gilded room, lit only by candlelight, Emperor Franz Joseph quietly ordered a discreet internal investigation, a secret committee, a committee that would peel back the darkest layers of the Habsburg past and uncover things even the emperor wished had stayed buried. The committee assembled in silence, just after midnight, when the palace corridors were empty and even the guards dozed in their booths. Franz Joseph could not risk his own ministers knowing about the secret crypt. Instead, he handpicked 3 men he trusted implicitly, though for very different reasons. Count Leopold von Herrenfels, the Empire's unofficial archivist of delicate matters, Father Matthias Reindl, a Jesuit scholar known for his unnerving knowledge of forbidden texts, and Dr. Elias Krüger, the royal physician, a man whose career had been spent treating the dynasty's unspoken afflictions. They gathered in a small chamber behind the Emperor's private library, a place reserved for discussions that would never appear in official records. Franz Joseph stood before them, hands clasped behind his back. "What was discovered in the crypt," he said, "must remain known to no more than the four of us here. Ever." His voice was cold, but beneath it trembled something unusual, fear. "These children," the Emperor continued, "are not anomalies of chance. I cannot accept that. They resemble descriptions I've only encountered in the most restricted records." Count Leopold's eyes narrowed. "Restricted records, Your Majesty." The Emperor took a breath, walked to a locked walnut chest and removed 3 weathered scrolls. He laid them on the table. Their ribbons bore the wax seal of an emperor dead nearly 2 centuries. "Leopold I," Franz Joseph said quietly, "a ruler haunted by what he called die Unglücklichen, the unfortunates." Father Matthias leaned forward, his shadow stretching over the table. "I had heard whispers that the early Habsburgs kept odd birth registers," he murmured. "Registers never meant for the church, nor the people." Dr. Krüger opened the first scroll with surgical precision, revealing sketches, rough, trembling strokes of charcoal depicting infants with bulging skulls, twisted jaws, limbs fused or unnaturally multiplied. Some looked barely human. "These drawings were made by the royal physician in 1683, Franz Joseph explained. He records 17 births of such nature over 6 years. 17, Leopold whispered, and none recorded? Not officially, the Emperor said. The midwives who saw them were silenced. The priest ordered not to write their names. The bodies buried in hidden places. Dr. Krüger looked up from the scroll. Majesty, these deformities are not random. They are consistent. These skull shapes, these jaw patterns, they resemble the severe craniofacial distortions caused by generations of lineage collapse. Inbreeding, Leopold said bluntly. More than that, Krüger replied. This is inbreeding intensified, weaponized by tradition. Franz Joseph nodded gravely. The early Habsburgs believed purity meant divinity. They believed mingling their blood with outsiders weakened their claim to rule, and so they risked this. He gestured toward the drawings. Father Matthias crossed himself. Then the chamber Joseph discovered is not unique. There may be more. Leopold looked up sharply. More? Matthias nodded. In medieval Europe, noble houses concealed malformed heirs not just to hide shame, but to prevent political exploitation. A rival could claim impurity of blood, accuse the dynasty of God's displeasure. Many families maintained secret burial vaults. But the Habsburgs, Franz Joseph said in a low voice, did more than conceal. They tried to understand. He opened the second scroll. This one wasn't drawings. It was observations, clinical notes detailing the heartbeat rhythms of infants whose chests were sunken, describing skulls that remained soft, far past normal weeks of infancy, recording cries that resembled not the human voice, but the raspy hiss of a small animal. Beneath the notes were signatures and countersignatures, each belonging to a doctor sworn to silence. Krüger exhaled slowly. Majesty, these are records of medical experimentation. Not experimentation, Franz Joseph said. Investigation. They wanted to trace the cause, to know which marriage unions caused which deformities, which pairings were safe, which were not. Matthias closed his eyes, trying to selectively avoid curses they inflicted on themselves. And failing, Leopold added. The Emperor placed the final scroll on the table. None of the others reached for it. It is the oldest, Franz Joseph said, written by Maximilian II in 1575. He unrolled it with slow, stiff fingers. Inside was a single sentence written in trembling Latin. Our blood is narrowing. The line cannot hold. I need you, the Emperor said, to find out how long this has been happening, and how many of these children lie hidden beneath our feet. Why now? Leopold asked softly. Why investigate this after so many centuries? Franz Joseph looked up, and for the first time they saw the shadow in his eyes. Because, he whispered, my own nephew was born with a jaw so malformed the court physicians hid him before dawn. Silence filled the room like a suffocating fog. "The pattern is returning," Franz Joseph said, "and I will not allow this family to collapse beneath secrets it has buried for generations." He stepped aside. "The crypt is to be opened again, all chambers, all sealed vaults. You three will descend into them, and you will tell me what lies beneath." The air in the chamber seemed to grow colder. For centuries the dead had remained silent. Now they were about to speak again. 3 nights later, long after the final candle had been extinguished in the Hofburg Palace, the 3 men descended into the imperial crypt with nothing but lanterns, notebooks, and a sealed order signed by the emperor himself. The Capuchin monks unlocked the heavy iron gate without a word. They bowed, not to the men, but to the darkness behind them, as though offering a silent apology for what the living were about to disturb. The monks did not accompany them. They refused. The lantern flames trembled as Leopold, Matthias and Kruger stepped onto the stone steps leading down. The air grew colder with each level, as if they were descending into the lungs of something ancient and sleeping. "We should begin with Josef's hidden chamber," Kruger said quietly. "No," Father Matthias replied. "We begin with the oldest burials. Whatever happened in that chamber may be only the end of a story that began long before." He lifted his lantern higher, revealing a carved inscription above one of the archways, "Familia sum, sed et sepultura." I am family, but also tomb. Leopold exhaled sharply. Morbid choice of words. "They were chosen deliberately," Matthias said. "The early Habsburgs believed the crypt connected the living to the dead in ways we no longer understand." They entered the first chamber. Rows of ornate sarcophagi lined the walls. Bronze, marble, silver. Angels with downcast eyes guarded the remains of emperors whose names still echoed in European history. The 3 men walked between them in reverent silence. Then they noticed something strange. At the far end of the room, well behind the grand sarcophagi, stood a simple wooden chest. Unadorned. Crude. It didn't belong here. Leopold bent down, brushing away dust that must have settled for centuries. The lid squeaked as he opened it. Inside were bones, small bones, infant bones. But these were different, far more normal than those Josef had found. Some delicate skulls were slightly misshapen, but nothing like the grotesque deformities in the hidden chamber. Kruger inspected them with a physician's precision. "These are children who died young," he said softly. "But their abnormalities are mild. This is consistent with mortality of the period. Nothing unusual." "Then why hide them?" Leopold whispered. Matthias lifted a brittle scrap of parchment from the bottom of the chest. The ink was faded, but he could still read it. "Born to the Archduchess during the illness of 1629. Conceal for political stability." Leopold frowned. "So even normal infant deaths were buried in secret?" "Of course," Matthias replied. "An emperor could not appear weak. A child's death was weakness. And a malformed child? Unthinkable." They moved on. In the next chamber they found another chest. This one was larger, sturdier, reinforced with iron bands. It took all 3 men to pry it open. Inside were parchment rolls, hundreds of them. Leopold nearly gasped. "My God, these are birth records!" Kruger lifted one gently, as if afraid it would disintegrate. The writing was in an archaic script. The child lived 18 hours, eyes sealed, limbs not separate. He replaced it and opened another. Female, stillborn, skull not closed. Matthias took a lantern closer. "These records begin in the 1500s and continue through the 1700s, generations of unrecorded children." Leopold's pulse quickened. "This is systematic concealment." "No," Matthias said solemnly. "This is management." The dynasty was controlling a bloodline it knew was deteriorating. Kruger stood very still. "Majesty must not see this," he whispered. Leopold turned to him sharply. "The Emperor ordered this investigation." "Yes," Kruger replied, voice low, "but some truths destroy more than they reveal." Matthias ignored them, turning toward a narrow corridor leading deeper underground. "We haven't reached the sealed vaults yet." The corridor was different from the rest of the crypt. The walls here were rougher, less ornate, and the floor sloped downward, as if they were entering a second, older structure beneath the visible crypt. A crypt beneath the crypt. A cold draft flowed out, carrying a scent that made the lantern flames waver. "Do you feel that?" Leopold asked. Matthias nodded. We are near a chamber that hasn't been opened for centuries, Kruger swallowed, or near something that never wanted to be opened. They walked on. At the end of the passage stood a small arched doorway sealed with plaster and reinforced with rusted iron. On the plaster, barely visible in the flickering torchlight, was an inscription scratched by a trembling hand. "Beware what was born in darkness, do not wake them." Matthias touched the plaster reverently. This seal predates Joseph's chamber, perhaps by 200 years. Leopold reached for his tools. "Are you sure?" Kruger whispered. "No," Leopold answered, "but we didn't come here to be sure." With 3 sharp strikes the plaster cracked. With a 4th, the seal gave way. A gust of air hissed out of the chamber, cold, stale and heavy with the scent of ancient decay. Matthias lifted his lantern inside, and all 3 men froze, for the chamber did not contain coffins. It contained shelves, dozens of them, filled with glass jars, and inside each jar floated something small, something pale, something shaped like an infant but twisted into impossible forms, preserved in yellowing liquid. The jars lined the walls from ceiling to floor, hundreds of them, a hidden archive of monstrosities. The Habsburgs hadn't just buried their secrets, they had catalogued them. For a moment none of the men breathed. The lantern light flickered across the glass jars, illuminating warped silhouettes suspended in the murky fluid. Some were curled into fetal positions, others floated with arms splayed at unnatural angles. A few had faces pressed against. The curved glass, mouths frozen in silent eternal screams. Leopold's voice trembled first. This is not a burial chamber." Dr. Kruger stepped forward, unable to look away. "No, this is a laboratory, an archive of specimens." Matthias made the sign of the cross. "God preserve their souls." The shelves stretched along the walls in precise, intentional rows, organised by size, perhaps by severity. The jars grew larger and more grotesque toward the far end. Some held infants with elongated skulls and swollen foreheads. Others had limbs twisted like branches or rib cages that collapsed inward. One jar revealed a tiny torso with 2 malformed heads sharing a single neck. Leopold gagged, turning away, but Kruger remained transfixed, drawn by a grim professional compulsion. "This level of preservation," he murmured, tracing a finger along one jar. "This method predates modern embalming. These specimens could be from the 17th century, or even earlier." "Who would do this?" Leopold asked. Matthias's lantern caught on a set of iron brackets fastened to a desk in the corner. Between them lay rusted surgical tools, bone saws, scalpels, curved needles, instruments not used for healing, but for dissection. Father Matthias swallowed hard. Someone who believed knowledge mattered more than mercy. Someone who saw these children not as souls, but as puzzles to be solved. Leopold steadied himself. "We must document every detail." "No," Kruger snapped. "We document nothing except what the Emperor explicitly asked. Some truths are too dangerous to be written down." Matthias stepped closer to the farthest shelves. "There is something else here." Beyond the jars lay a wooden cabinet sealed with a thick iron clasp. The wood was warped with age, its surface darkened by centuries of moisture. Matthias tugged the clasp, stuck. Leopold helped. Together they pried it open. Inside lay a stack of leather-bound books, journals. Matthias lifted one gently. The pages were stiff but intact. He flipped to the first entry. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if written by trembling hands. "Year of our Lord 1611. His Majesty commands me to continue the study of the tainted line. The births cannot be explained by natural causes alone. We must find the pattern within the blood." Kruger closed his eyes. It was sanctioned by the Emperor himself. Leopold stared at the rows of jars, horror dawning. They weren't hiding these children. They were studying them, testing theories, searching for ways to predict which marriages would produce viable heirs. Matthias continued reading. The words grew worse. "Some infants live long enough for observation. Their cries are thin and unnatural. We take note of their breathing patterns, their muscle stiffness, their skull shapes. In them we see warnings of what the future of the dynasty may hold if the blood is not corrected." Further entries described attempts to compare skeletal structures, to track deformities across generations. Some pages mentioned controlled unions, genetic ratios, and corrections to the ancestral formula. And then, one chilling line, the Empress herself commands that deformities are to be neither pitied nor feared, but understood. Matthias shut the book. His hands shook. "This is blasphemy," he whispered. "They treated these infants as experiments, as specimens." Kruger's face had gone pale. "It explains the jars. They weren't preserving the bodies out of respect. They were preserving them to learn from them." Leopold wiped sweat from his brow, though the air was freezing. Did the dynasty know how far this went? Does Franz Joseph know? Matthias looked at the hundreds of preserved forms suspended in silence. If he doesn't, he will soon. Should he? Kruger asked quietly. Should anyone know? Leopold didn't answer. He couldn't. Then Matthias noticed something else, an empty space on the bottom shelf. Dust outlines suggested a jar had once been there, recently removed. "Someone has been here," Matthias murmured. Leopold turned sharply. Impossible. The seal outside hadn't been broken. Kruger lifted the lantern to the empty spot, examining the dust. No, the jar wasn't removed recently, but not centuries ago either, maybe decades. "Which means," Matthias whispered, "someone in Franz Joseph's lifetime knew this chamber existed. Someone before Joseph ever stumbled upon the other." A chill ran through all three men. "This goes deeper than a forgotten vault," Leopold said. "This was a secret passed down, protected, maintained." Matthias looked toward the darkness beyond the shelves. "And if these jars were just research," he said slowly, "then where are the results?" Kruger closed his notebook. "Still buried," he said, "and we're going to find them." The three men lifted their lanterns. Another passageway branched off from the jar chamber, narrow, low, and almost entirely swallowed by shadow. Without speaking, they stepped into it. Behind them, the preserved faces stared silently through glass, as if waiting for the living to understand the full horror of what the Habsburgs had done. The narrow passageway seemed to swallow their lantern light as they moved deeper underground, the air growing colder, denser, almost viscous. The walls here were rougher than any part of the crypt so far, carved hastily, without symmetry or artistry. This place was not built for ceremony, it was built for secrecy. Leopold ran his hand along the stone. "This isn't Habsburg construction," he murmured. "This predates the empire by centuries." Matthias nodded. "Some believe the crypt was built atop older catacombs, perhaps monastic, perhaps even pagan," Kruger shivered. "Pagan tunnels beneath the resting place of emperors. How fitting!" The floor sloped downward again, and the temperature dropped even further. Leopold could see his breath. Matthias raised his lantern. The flame trembled. Then they reached a fork. Two tunnels diverged, one descending sharply into darkness, the other rising slightly, curving left. Both were unmarked. Kruger sighed. "Do we split up?" Matthias snapped. "Absolutely not. The dead may be silent, but the living must stay together." Leopold pointed to the rising tunnel. "Airflow is coming from there. If we follow it, we might find an exit or a chamber connected to the main crypt." Kruger shook his head. "But the Emperor said we must find all sealed vaults. That likely means following the lower passage, the deeper path." Matthias looked between them. "The air through the left tunnel is fresher. That means activity, human activity at some point." "And the other?" Leopold asked. Matthias stared into the downward darkness. "That one leads to where things were meant never to be found." A silence settled over them, heavy as the rock above. Finally, Leopold exhaled. "We go down." They stepped into the lower passage. The slope grew steeper, forcing them to brace against the walls. Moisture dripped from unseen cracks. Their lanterns flickered in the currents that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Then the walls widened. The tunnel opened into a chamber far larger than the jar room. Their lanterns barely reached the edges. The ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow. In the centre stood an elevated stone table, cold, black, and worn at the edges, a slab used for examinations. Kruger approached it. His voice trembled. "This is an autopsy table." Leopold knelt beside it, brushing dust away. Faint grooves carved into the stone formed a shallow perimeter, channels leading to a basin at the base. "A drainage system," Kruger whispered, "to carry away fluids." Matthias swallowed hard. This was no burial vault, it was a mortuary. He stepped around the table, lantern raised, and froze. On the far wall, Iron hooks jutted from the stone. Upon them hung objects wrapped in decaying cloth. Kruger reached out, pulling one cloth gently aside. A skeleton stared back. Tiny, misshapen, its skull elongated, jaw crooked, ribs warped into a shape no human anatomy should take. Kruger staggered back. Good God! Leopold turned to another cloth-wrapped figure. He hesitated, then pulled the fabric down. Another infant skeleton, this one with two spines spiralling together like twisted vines. Matthias whispered a prayer. There were dozens of them. Dozens. Arranged as if someone had been studying them long after death. Kruger steadied himself, though his face had gone chalk white. These deformities are consistent with the jar specimens, but skeletons like these would not have been preserved by natural mummification. Someone prepared them, cleaned them, arranged them. Leopold's stomach twisted. Why? To compare structures, Kruger replied, to understand the severity, to map a progression. Matthias shook his head. Progression toward what? Kruger didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, he said, toward the collapse of a bloodline, toward predicting when the dynasty would no longer be viable. Leopold felt his hands tremble. So they tracked their own doom. Matthias heard something, soft, faint, like a whisper of breath. He raised his lantern quickly. A second passageway, almost invisible, branched off the mortuary chamber. Its entrance was lower, half hidden behind a fallen beam, just wide enough for a small adult to crawl through. A passage a full-grown man would never have found unless he knew to look. There's something else, Matthias whispered. Something deeper still. Kruger stared at the small opening. Only one of us can fit at a time. Leopold stepped back. Not me. I barely fit through the last narrow corridor. Matthias looked at Kruger. We can't stop here. The Emperor ordered us to find every secret. Kruger hesitated. What if that secret was hidden for a reason? Everything in this place was hidden for a reason, Matthias replied, and every reason is worse than the one before. Matthias handed his lantern to Leopold, then lowered himself onto the stone floor. He lay flat, took a breath, and crawled into the darkness. The narrow passage scraped his shoulders. Stone pressed against his ribs. He dragged himself forward inch by inch as the air grew thinner and colder. Then the ground levelled. A wider space. Matthias raised his lantern, and what he saw made the blood in his veins turn to ice. It wasn't another chamber. It was a nursery, a secret underground nursery. Tiny cribs, old wooden toys, rusted feeding instruments, blankets long decayed, and on the back wall, marked in soot, were tally marks, hundreds of them, as if someone had once kept count of how many infants had been held in this hidden place. Matthias gasped, because beside the tally marks were names, names erased from history, names of Habsburg children who never appeared in any official record. He understood then. The deformities weren't only studied after death. Some children had been kept alive, hidden, forgotten, erased. Matthias stared into the hollow cribs and felt something primal rise in his throat. Terror. Because one crib wasn't empty. Something small was lying inside. Something wrapped in decayed cloth. Something that moved. For an instant, Matthias thought his lantern flame had distorted his vision, that the shape in the crib was nothing more than cloth shifting in a draught. But then it moved again. Slow, unmistakable, a frail stirring beneath layers of ancient fabric. His throat closed. No sound emerged, only cold. He forced himself forward inch by inch until he stood over the crib. The cloth was grey with age, stiff and brittle. Something underneath. Breathed. Shallow, ragged, like air forced through a narrowing gap. Impossible, Matthias whispered. No one could still be alive down here. Not after centuries, not even months. The movement continued. He reached out, hands trembling uncontrollably, and gently peeled back the cloth. At first, he saw only dark, wrinkled skin stretched tightly over bone, a face so shrunken it resembled a doll left too close to a fire. But the eyes, God help him, the eyes were open. Two black glassy orbs stared back at him, and blinked. Matthias stumbled backward, hitting the wall so hard his lantern shook. The creature, no, the child, he reminded himself with a desperate, failing sense of compassion, gasped, mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. A thin, broken whimper escaped its throat. "Matthias!" Leopold's voice echoed faintly from the mortuary chamber. "What do you see?" Matthias opened his mouth, but no words formed. He crawled backward toward the low passage, heart hammering, eyes never leaving the crib. The child shifted again. An arm emerged, tiny, thin as twigs, but with a wrist bent so sharply it looked snapped. Fingers fused together, skin mottled. Every breath seemed to hurt it. "Matthias!" Kruger shouted. "Answer us!" Finally he found his voice, thin, cracked. "Something's alive!" The words echoed through the stone corridors like a curse. On the other side, conversation erupted. Shouts, disbelief, fear. Kruger began crawling into the narrow tunnel immediately, Leopold pushing behind him despite the tightness. Matthias kept staring at the child as Kruger squeezed into the nursery. When the physician saw the crib, he froze. His voice was barely a whisper. "Dear God, no!" Leopold's muffled voice behind him demanded, "What is it? What do you see?" Kruger stepped toward the crib, slowly, reverently, horrified. "This infant," he whispered, examining the fragile body with trembling hands. "This infant is days old, a week at most." Matthias shook his head violently. "Days? That's impossible. Look at the decay. Look at the blankets." "The blankets are old," Kruger cut in, "but the child is not." Leopold's hand emerged through the passage, groping for leverage. "Explain yourself," Kruger's voice darkened. "Someone brought this infant here recently. Someone alive. Someone who knew this place." A silence fell so absolute that Matthias could hear his own heartbeat. Leopold finally pushed his way fully into the nursery, breathless and confused. He saw the crib and staggered backward, hand over his mouth. That thing is alive!" Kruger rounded on him. "It is not a thing." He placed a hand over the child's chest, barely rising, barely falling. This infant was born just days ago. It's severely deformed, yes, but alive, or was kept alive long enough to die down here. Matthias felt a sudden wave of nausea. Who would do that? Who could possibly? Kruger looked up, eyes haunted. The same people who preserved hundreds of specimens, the same people who studied these deformities for centuries. Someone in the imperial household still knows. Someone is continuing the practice. Leopold clutched the wall. But why bring a child here? Why hide it? There's only one reason, Kruger whispered. This infant is Habsburg. Matthias felt his blood turn cold. Are you saying the deformities have returned? That the bloodline is collapsing again? Kruger didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the child gently from the crib. It let out a faint, pained cry, its chest heaving weakly. We need to get it out of here, Kruger said. If it lives even a few minutes, we might... A sound cut him off. A soft sound. Not from the infant, from deeper in the shadows of the nursery. A shuffle, a breath, a shifting of weight. Matthias raised his lantern, hand trembling. There was another crib in the corner, a larger one, and in that crib, something sat up, slowly. Leopold choked on his own breath. That cannot be an infant. It wasn't. It was older, maybe 5, maybe 6, and its limbs were twisted, its spine curved, its head shaped in a way no human head should be, but its eyes were aware, and watching them, silent, unblinking, alive. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Not Matthias, not Leopold, not even Kruger, whose clinical certainty had wavered the moment he saw the silhouette rising from the second crib. Matthias lifted his lantern higher, fighting every instinct in his body to simply run. The figure in the crib sat upright, jerky, mechanical, unnatural. Its head listed to the side at an impossible angle, and its small, withered arms hung stiffly at its sides. The shadows stretched across its face, turning every contour into something monstrous. And then, with a faint creak, the figure's torso leaned forward. Leopold gasped, stumbling backward. It's moving! Kruger's voice snapped sharply. Stop! Look again! Matthias narrowed his eyes, forcing himself to focus through the trembling of his hands. The figure had moved. That much was certain. But now, in the lantern glow, the details became clearer and stranger. It was not a living child at all. Its skin was wax, Its eyes were glass, and its limbs, jointed at strange angles, were connected by thin metal rods and tension wires. An automaton? Matthias whispered. Kruger climbed closer, horror mixing with fascination. Not quite. This is a teaching model. 18th century, maybe earlier. Waxwork anatomy figures were common in Florence, Vienna. But this is beyond anything I've seen. Leopold pushed forward hesitantly and squinted at the figure. The lantern light flickered across its face, revealing delicate, painstaking craftsmanship. Veins painted beneath translucent wax, tiny imperfections mimicking real skin, a faint blush at the cheeks. But the proportions were all wrong. The head too large, the limbs too short, the spine unnaturally curved. "This is a replica of deformity," Kruger murmured, voice low with awe and dread. A study of congenital anomalies, sculpted with terrifying accuracy. "But how did it move?" Leopold demanded. "I saw it sit up, we all did." Kruger pointed to the base of the crib. A thin metal lattice lay half buried in dust. Springs, pulleys, miniature counterweights. "When the air in this chamber shifts, the springs contract or expand," the physician explained. "Temperature changes, pressure differences, even our lantern heaters would cause subtle mechanical motion." Matthias exhaled shakily. "So, it's not alive." "No," Kruger said softly. "But someone wanted it to appear so." Leopold shivered. "But why hide such models here? Why conceal them in a sealed crypt?" Kruger did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the first crib, the one that had held the frail, breathing body. He touched the blanket, lifted it. Beneath the cloth was not an infant but a desiccated wax model, so perfectly crafted that, in dim light, its cracked, brittle surface could mimic the tremors of breath. "A trick of the eye," Kruger whispered. "The heat of the lantern made the wax shift. You mistook the contracting material for respiration." Matthias's stomach twisted. "So these are all replicas?" "Exact replicas," the physician said grimly, "based on real children born to the imperial line." The realization hit like a blow. "These models," Kruger continued, voice barely audible, "were used for medical study, to understand the hereditary deformities plaguing the Habsburgs. Someone, likely centuries ago, commissioned an artist to recreate these anomalies with absolute precision." Leopold swallowed hard. "But why store them here, in a hidden chamber?" Kruger gazed at the mechanical crib, the meticulously crafted wax infant. "Because the anomalies themselves were a state secret. The royal family did not want Europe to know the true extent of the hereditary deformities, and these models," he gestured to the mechanical figure, "are evidence far too dangerous for the light of day." A cold draft swept through the nursery. The lantern flickered. Something clinked softly in the dark corner beyond the cribs, a faint metallic sound, like a chain shifting as if stirred by a breath. Matthias tensed. Leopold's hand went instinctively to the wall. Kruger turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "Did one of you touch something?" the physician asked. Both men shook their heads. The clink came again, then a soft scrape, metal against stone. Matthias raised the lantern one more inch. His breath stalled. Beyond the two cribs where the darkness thickened and the walls curved inward, he could see the faint outline of another structure, a table, and on that table, rows of wax heads, dozens of them, each with the unmistakable Habsburg jaw and each fitted with mechanical components. Some had eyes that gleamed in the lantern light, some had jaws wired to open and close, some, God help them, were rigged to move, and one of them was turning, slowly, deliberately, toward them. For a long, breathless moment the three men could only stare. The wax head, its features painstakingly sculpted to resemble the unmistakable Habsburg profile, rotated on a small iron spindle built beneath its neck. The motion was slow, irregular, powered by some mechanism hidden inside the table. Its painted eyes, glassy and unblinking, seemed to follow the lantern's glow across the chamber. Leopold whispered, That cannot be accidental." Kruger forced himself forward, though his steps were hardly more than reluctant shuffles. "The heat again," he said, though his voice trembled with doubt. "The springs react to temperature. The metal expands, the gears shift. We're triggering a system meant to animate these models." Matthias swallowed, throat dry as parchment. "Then why is it turning toward us specifically? Kruger didn't answer. Instead, he leaned over the table, lantern light casting sharp shadows across the array of wax heads. A metallic clatter sounded beneath the table, gears unwinding, springs tightening, mechanisms waking after centuries of silence. Matthias felt something primitive tighten in his gut. The entire table was a machine. "Look here," Kruger said, voice steadier now that the intellectual puzzle had seized him. He pointed to the underside of the closest wax head. "These are remnants of a movement mechanism, like the ones used in early automata. Clockwork, Baroque-era engineering." Leopold peered closer, though his expression was an uncomfortable mix of fascination and dread. "They were meant to move." "Oh yes," Kruger whispered. "This was a teaching apparatus. You wind the mechanism and the heads simulate different musculoskeletal deformities, jaw dislocation, cranial tension, facial asymmetry. The motion shows doctors how such anomalies might behave in living patients." Matthias shook his head slowly. "No medical school I've ever known would hide such things in a crypt." Kruger grimaced. "Because no medical school commissioned them. This was private work, secret work." A faint click echoed through the chamber, then another, then a slow groaning sound, metal resisting motion after centuries of stillness. Matthias raised the lantern higher. Several heads were turning now, one rotated right, another tilted downward. A third shuddered as gears inside its skull twitched and seized. Leopold stepped back until his shoulders hit the wall. "Turn them off," he said, voice cracking, "or make it stop." "There's no power source," Kruger murmured. "These should not be moving at all." Matthias exhaled shakily. "Are you saying they're triggered by us? By our presence?" Kruger straightened slowly. "No, not by us." He pointed toward the corner of the ceiling where a faint hole, no bigger than a coin, was carved into the stone. "Airflow," he said. "A ventilation shaft. The heat of our lanterns is pushing warm air upward, drawing cold air from the shaft in a steady stream. That change activates the ancient mechanisms." Matthias felt the tension in his chest ease, slightly. "So this is all just physics," Leopold said, though he didn't sound fully convinced. "For now," Kruger replied. Matthias raised an eyebrow. "For now?" The physician gestured around the room. "This nursery, this laboratory, was sealed deliberately. The automata were never meant to be discovered. Whoever built them was studying hereditary deformities with a level of obsession that borders on madness. And that begs the question." He let the words hang. Leopold finally whispered, "Who built this place?" Before Kruger could answer, another sound cut through the chamber. A soft thump, not mechanical, not metal, organic. It came from behind the table. Matthias felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He lifted the lantern and stepped around the corner, Kruger and Leopold close behind. The lantern's glow reached the far wall. A narrow wooden cabinet stood there, its door slightly ajar. The thump had come from inside it. Matthias swallowed. "Another automaton?" Kruger shook his head. "No, the sound was heavier. Too heavy." Leopold's breathing quickened. "Then what?" Matthias reached out and pulled the cabinet door open. The lantern illuminated shelves lined with glass jars, hundreds of them, each containing preserved specimens, organs, bones, malformed limbs suspended in yellowed fluid. But the thump, it hadn't come from the jars. At the bottom of the cabinet lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover bore the imperial crest, worn, cracked, but unmistakable, and stamped beneath it, "Private, Dr. Ignaz Roth, Imperial Medical Examiner, 1731. Kruger inhaled sharply. Roth. He was rumoured to have conducted forbidden anatomical research on the Habsburg line. Matthias picked up the journal. As he did, something slipped out from between its pages. A sketch of a head, angled precisely like the wax model before them. But this one was labelled. It bore a name, a royal name, and beside it, in Roth's careful handwriting, to be animated for further study. The wax heads were not mere teaching tools, they were records, and someone had been trying to replicate the movements of real, living royal infants. Matthias looked up slowly. The gears behind the wax heads clicked again. Then, impossibly, one of them smiled. The smile froze the three men in place. It was not human, and it was not alive, but it looked disturbingly lifelike, a a cruel mimicry of what a child's innocent expression should be. The wax lips were cracked, but the curve was perfect, almost deliberate, as if the maker had intended it to haunt anyone who gazed too long. Matthias swallowed hard. This is deliberate. Someone designed these automata to appear alive, to terrify, to record movement, to catalogue deformity in motion. Kruger's eyes roamed the room, taking in the hundreds of mechanized heads, the scattered journals, the jars, the shelves of wax limbs. "It's more than medical study," he said. "It's obsession, madness masquerading as science, and yet it's organized, ordered. Every specimen has a purpose, every mechanism precise." Leopold muttered under his breath, staring at a row of wax heads lined along a table like soldiers. God, centuries of secrecy. How many families kept such archives? Matthias shook his head. Perhaps none as extensive as this. A sudden noise startled them, a metallic groan from behind the cribs. The faint hum of air moving through the ventilation shafts combined with the spring-loaded mechanisms. A gear twitched, a pulley released. The entire room seemed to breathe. Kruger raised a hand, stepped back. These mechanisms are delicate and unstable. One misstep, and centuries of hidden engineering could collapse, possibly with us inside. Leopold stepped cautiously toward the exit, eyes fixed on the nearest crib. Matthias followed, lantern held high. But as he passed the last table, he noticed something unsettling. A wax infant sitting alone, a miniature Habsburg in perfect detail, its eyes glassy, a small hand outstretched as if seeking something, someone. Matthias shivered. Look at it. It's begging. Kruger exhaled, a cold laugh escaping him. Begging. Not for mercy, but for attention. It wants to be observed. That's the nature of the automata. They were created to be watched, to simulate the tragic lives of the dynasty's afflicted children. Leopold's stomach churned. And the jars? The preserved specimens? Kruger gestured at the far corner. Those were the originals. Real children preserved after death. The wax figures are their mechanical avatars, motion models, replicas, perhaps used to train midwives and physicians. Think of it as a catalogue of doom. Matthias's eyes widened. So, Josef Kaltner's discovery, the supposed living infants, was simply the perception of these models in motion. The flickering lantern light, shifting shadows, the springs reacting to our presence. Kruger nodded grimly. Exactly. The imagination fills in the gaps. Fear animates the inanimate. Leopold swallowed hard. But why go to such lengths? Why make these wax models? Animate. Kruger looked toward the far wall where another jar lay tipped slightly on its side. Its contents, a tiny, malformed skull, eyes missing, jaw twisted, seemed to glare even in death. Control, knowledge. The Habsburgs were obsessed with maintaining power, projecting perfection, and understanding the limits of their bloodline. And what better way than to study the anomalies of their lineage in secret, away from prying eyes? Matthias's hand hovered over the journals stacked neatly in the corner. And these records, they show the study of every child, every anomaly, every birth that didn't conform. Kruger nodded. They were cataloguing their own failures, hiding them behind layers of secrecy, turning tragedy into object lessons. But secrecy demands meticulous engineering, hence the wax automata, the hidden chambers, the labyrinthine corridors. A faint sound made them freeze. From the upper ventilation shaft came a soft, rhythmic clink. The air shivered, carrying it down the stone corridor. Someone must have maintained this, Leopold whispered, or at least checked it occasionally. Otherwise, why are some mechanisms still responsive after centuries? Kruger exhaled slowly. Perhaps not. Some machines, designed with care, can last longer than their makers. This archive has endured in silence, recording the consequences of royal obsession without any human intervention. Matthias's hand shook as he lifted another wax head from its shelf. The glassy eyes reflected his own. It's like looking into the past, into centuries of secrecy, fear, and guilt. The Habsburgs left this behind as a warning, or maybe as proof they could bend life and death to their will. Leopold stepped back, voice barely audible. or as proof that some secrets were never meant to be revealed. The three men stood among the mechanized infants, jars and journals. The flickering lantern light danced across twisted wax and glass, metal and bone, reflecting centuries of obsession. Kruger finally spoke. "We must report this, but only what the Emperor must know. The rest, let it remain buried, hidden, as it has been for hundreds of years." Matthias glanced once more at the moving wax infant, now motionless again as the air settled. "Yes, some things are too powerful to see in full light." Leopold nodded silently. "And yet, we saw enough." Kruger replaced the wax head carefully on the shelf. Enough to understand, enough to fear, enough to know that even the most powerful family in Europe could not control the consequences of its own blood. A sudden breeze stirred the lantern flames. The shadows danced across the room one last time, and the gears of the automata creaked quietly in the silence that followed. The hidden Habsburg archive had spoken, and for the first time in centuries no human was watching. The three men stood in silence, letting the lantern's warm glow wash over the eerie nursery. The wax automata, glass eyes, and preserved specimens seemed almost to exhale with them, the ancient cold settling into their bones. Each man understood in a way he could not articulate the weight of what they had discovered. These were not simply the remnants of a dynasty. They were a chronicle of obsession, fear, and hubris stretching across centuries. Matthias exhaled shakily. "We need to leave this place. Document it carefully, but quietly. If word of this chamber spreads, it could destroy the House of Habsburg." Kruger nodded. "Agreed. But first, we must examine the journals. Roth's writings, the physician's sketches, the observations of centuries. There may be knowledge here that is critical, not just for understanding the past, but for the Emperor's present." Leopold's face remained pale, but he stepped toward the cabinet, gently lifting the oldest journal. Dust fell in soft clouds as he opened it. The writing, faint but legible, chronicled in exacting detail the study of deformities within the imperial family, noting each infant's birth condition and anatomical peculiarities. Matthias leaned closer. "Look here. It details not only birth anomalies, but the methods used to preserve and model them. Wax, glass, metal springs, every deformity meticulously recreated, and the author, Roth, comments repeatedly on the necessity of secrecy, how carefully they hid their failures from the world." Kruger's gaze flicked across the room, lingering on the jars of preserved specimens. These archives weren't just medical, they were political. The Habsburgs needed to maintain the illusion of perfection. One malformed heir in public could destabilize centuries of power. Leopold traced his finger over a column of numbers in the journal. "Do you see this? Each entry has a corresponding wax model, and note. Some models are annotated with instructions for movement. This was not merely for static study. The Emperor of the time wanted these models to simulate life." Matthias shivered. Simulate life? To study what exactly? Their potential? Their flaws? Kruger shook his head slowly. To understand inevitability, bloodline inheritance, to predict outcomes without risk to living heirs, it is both brilliant and horrifying. A sudden sound echoed from the upper tunnel, the soft scuff of stone on stone. The three men froze. Leopold whispered, "Someone's up there, or has been recently." Matthias swallowed. "Impossible. The crypt has been sealed for centuries." Kruger's lips pressed together. Perhaps the crypt is never truly alone. Someone may have maintained it, checked it, even in secret. Perhaps a loyal servant, a court physician, or an obscure branch of the family itself. The thought made their skin crawl. Kruger turned back to the journals, flipping to the most recent entries. The last pages were fragile, yellowed, and covered with the careful hand of a 1731 annotator. It is necessary to preserve knowledge of the afflicted line. Wax, glass, and metal shall serve where the living cannot. Let no one outside the chamber know. The dynasty must endure. The bloodline must be understood. Matthias's eyes widened. It's as if Roth anticipated discovery, that someone, centuries later, would uncover these secrets. Leopold whispered, almost to himself. And yet, why keep them moving? The automata? Kruger's voice was low, almost reverent. To remind anyone who enters that the consequences of power are not inert, that the dead, real or replicated, carry the weight of truth. The three men worked carefully, cataloguing journals, sketching diagrams, and photographing what they could with discrete tools. Each wax model, each jar, each mechanism told a story, an anatomy of secrecy that had been hidden for generations. Hours passed like minutes. The cold, the shadows, the faint creaks of century-old wood and metal pressed down on them, a constant reminder that history has its own heartbeat, slow, inexorable, merciless. Finally, Kruger spoke. "We've documented as much as we can without disturbing the mechanisms. It's time to leave the chamber." Matthias lifted the lantern, casting one last glance at the wax automata. Each head seemed to stare at them, eyes glassy, lips frozen, some twisted in ways that mimicked life. The three men could almost feel centuries of silent observation weighing upon them. Leopold shivered. Do we seal it again, or leave it for someone else to find? Kruger's hand rested on the cold stone wall. Sealed, as it always has been. The knowledge and the horror belong to the dynasty alone. It must remain hidden. Matthias nodded. Yes, for the good of history, perhaps even for the good of the living. They retraced their steps through the narrow passages, the heavy stone closing behind them as they ascended toward the main crypt. The cold air of the surface greeted them with relief, and the distant hum of the city seemed almost alien compared to the silence below. Outside, the night sky was clear. Stars glittered faintly over Vienna. The Hofburg Palace loomed silently behind them, its gilded roof catching the moonlight. The living world continued, oblivious to the centuries of secrets buried beneath its foundations. Matthias turned to his companions. The Emperor must know, but even he cannot understand the full scope of this. It's beyond comprehension. Kruger exhaled, the wind freezing his breath. And perhaps that is precisely why it must remain hidden. Some truths are too dangerous to see fully. Leopold glanced back at the sealed crypt entrance. We've seen the past, but it isn't done speaking. Every secret has a way of waiting for discovery, for reckoning. A long silence followed as the three men made their way back through the palace corridors, carrying journals, sketches, and memories heavy enough to haunt the rest of their lives. Deep beneath them, in the hidden nursery, the wax automata rested once more. Springs coiled, gears settled, eyes glassy and unblinking as if waiting for the next visitor, another century, another generation to awaken them. History had spoken, and it would not be quiet again. In the following days, Leopold, Kruger, and Matthias convened in the safety of a private study, far from the echoing corridors of the Hofburg. The journals, sketches, and photographs they had collected lay spread across the table like an unholy feast of knowledge. Matthias finally broke the silence. We have a responsibility to record what we've found, but it must be careful. The Emperor will know enough, but the public, they cannot see this. The implications are too vast, too scandalous. Kruger nodded. I agree. The Habsburgs meticulously managed their image for centuries. To reveal this, the wax figures, the jars, the mechanized automata, the public would be horrified. And yet historians need to know. If we suppress it entirely, the truth dies. Leopold leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. And the journals? Roth's writings, his meticulous documentation, should they be transcribed, translated, or destroyed? Matthias exchanged a look with Kruger. Transcribe, but secure. Translation should remain within trusted scholarly circles. The knowledge is valuable for understanding genetics, inheritance, and historical practices. But exposure could be catastrophic. We are guardians, not announcers. Kruger paused, tracing a finger along one of the wax head diagrams. I cannot shake this, he said quietly. The level of foresight, of obsession. Roth anticipated not only discovery, but the careful handling of his work centuries later. He engineered this crypt, these automata, these journals, with the understanding that only a select few might ever witness it. Leopold exhaled sharply. It's almost alive in its own way. A silent chronicle that continues to speak across time. Matthias nodded. Precisely. The Habsburgs, Roth, the dynasty, they created a living memory. A mechanical and anatomical record of their bloodline, their mistakes, their fears. Kruger's gaze fell on one of the photographs of the wax models. It is haunting. The automata, The way the gears and pulleys were engineered to mimic motion. It's as if they were trying to simulate life itself, to keep the memory of the afflicted line present, even when the children themselves were gone. Leopold shuddered. And yet, the public never knew. History only recorded victories, marriages, wars, coronations. None of this meticulous accounting of deformity, of hereditary risk, of obsession with perfection, it remained invisible, until now. Matthias leaned over the table, scanning the journals once more. We must also consider why some of the mechanisms still moved. The air currents in the crypt, our lanterns, we triggered centuries-old engineering by accident. That's a powerful reminder of how enduring and deliberate this secrecy was. Kruger's voice dropped to a near whisper. And the automata. They weren't merely for observation. They were warnings, reminders. The dynasty was obsessed with predicting, controlling, and preserving its bloodline. Each wax figure, each mechanized movement, each journal entry, it's as if they were saying, "Look what we must endure to maintain power." Leopold nodded slowly. It's terrifying to think of it that way, not just as a medical archive, but as a testament to obsession and fear. Matthias sighed. And it's not just history. There is a lesson here. The lengths people will go to preserve control, to manipulate perception, to manage a legacy. We see it even now in politics, in families, in power structures. Kruger's eyes hardened. Which is why we are witnesses. We have to ensure the story is told in part, but with care. The world does not need the spectacle of wax figures, mechanical heads, and jars to understand the danger of unchecked obsession. But we must preserve the knowledge for those who study history, for the truth of what transpired. Leopold leaned back, still staring at the collection before them. It's remarkable. A dynasty's failure, captured not just in archives, but in motion, in form, in mechanics, centuries of obsession frozen in time, and yet, it still has the power to disturb, to unsettle, to teach. Matthias smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. We have witnessed a chapter of European history that most will never see, and now it is our duty to carry it forward responsibly. Kruger glanced at the photographs, sketches, and journals one last time. This crypt, this nursery, these automata, they were created to survive the living, and survive they have. We must honour that endurance, and yet tread carefully. Knowledge is power, but power unchecked can be monstrous. The three men sat quietly, letting the gravity of their discovery settle over them like a shadow. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the secrets buried beneath the palace, of the wax heads and jars, of the mechanical nursery that held the echoes of centuries. And deep in the crypt, where time had paused, the automata remained silent once more, as if waiting, for the next careful observer, for the next witness to uncover the legacy of obsession that the Habsburgs had left behind. Weeks passed, and the three men continued their work in careful secrecy. The journals were transcribed and catalogued. Photographs and sketches were meticulously organised. Every mechanism, every wax figure, every preserved specimen was recorded in exacting detail, ensuring that the history of the crypt and the obsession it contained would not be lost. Yet even as they worked, a sense of unease persisted. Matthias finally voiced what all three men had felt in silence. Every time I study these materials, I feel watched, not by the figures themselves, they are lifeless, but by the intentions of the people who created them. Roth, the Habsburgs, they anticipated discovery, they engineered it. Kruger nodded, his gaze fixed on a particularly twisted wax figure. It is as if the crypt itself is a warning, not just a record of deformity, but of the lengths to which power can bend morality. Knowledge without compassion becomes cruelty. Leopold, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. And yet it is astonishingly precise. The mechanisms, the modelling, centuries-old automata that still respond to air currents, lantern heat. It's almost impossible to fathom. Who else could have created such things? Kruger gestured toward the journals. Roth's writings suggest he was obsessed with understanding the hereditary line at any cost. He combined art, anatomy, and mechanical ingenuity to create something that would outlast the living, to preserve the memory of what the dynasty feared most, imperfection, and he succeeded. The crypt is a testament to that obsession. Matthias turned a page carefully. What strikes me is the meticulous secrecy. Every wax figure, every automaton, every preserved specimen is hidden from the world. The dynasty wanted to appear flawless, yet Roth ensured that the failures were immortalized, but in shadows, not in light. Leopold exhaled. The Habsburgs were obsessed with perfection, but this is beyond obsession. It borders on reverence for their own control over life and death. Kruger leaned back, folding his hands. And yet, that control is an illusion. These children, real or replicated, cannot speak. They cannot intervene. They are trapped between life and history. And even now, centuries later, we are the witnesses. It is the living who carry the burden of understanding. A sudden quiet fell over the room, as though the shadows themselves had gathered around them. Outside, the sounds of Vienna continued, indifferent to the secrets buried beneath centuries of stone and secrecy. Matthias whispered, "It is ironic. The dynasty sought to understand their bloodline, to anticipate deformity, to preserve the lineage. Yet in doing so, they created a record that speaks more about obsession than about biology." Kruger's eyes gleamed with a mixture of fear and fascination. Yes, it is a chronicle of the human psyche, a mechanical and anatomical archive of power, fear, and mortality. The wax heads, the automata, the journals, they are as much about the creators as they are about the children they depict. Leopold shivered. And what of the emperor? Does he truly understand what lies beneath his palace? The depth of secrecy, the scale of obsession? Matthias shook his head. Perhaps he does. Perhaps he does not. Some secrets are meant only for those willing to bear their weight. The rest of the world continues without knowing, as it always has. Kruger studied a mechanical infant on a nearby table, its tiny arms poised in mid-motion. These automata endure. They wait. They teach. They warn. Roth designed them to outlast centuries of human life, to remain a witness even when the living forget. And now, we are their audience. A flicker of lantern light cast long shadows across the wax figures and jars. The gears and springs, long dormant, creaked faintly as though stirred by the very presence of attention. The crypt had awakened in memory and mechanism to acknowledge its witnesses. Matthias closed the final journal with a soft thud. We cannot linger. History has revealed itself, but it is not ours to keep. We have seen the consequences of obsession, of secrecy, of power wielded without restraint. Let us leave the crypt as it has always been, silent, hidden, yet alive in its own way. Leopold nodded, feeling the weight of the discovery press upon him. We carry the knowledge, but the silence must remain. Some truths are too dangerous to show in the daylight. Kruger exhaled, the shadowed room heavy with the gravity of centuries. And yet, by bearing witness, we ensure that history remembers not just the dynasty, but the cost of obsession and the fragility of human life caught in the machinery of power. The three men rose, carefully covering the automata and returning the journals to their hiding places. Outside, the night waited. The crypt remained below, undisturbed, silent, and mechanical, its secret preserved for another century, another careful observer. As they exited the palace, the air of Vienna was crisp, yet the memory of the crypt followed them like a shadow. The wax heads, the jars, the mechanical infants, they were not just relics of a dynasty's obsession. They were a reminder that power, secrecy, and knowledge, when intertwined, can leave a legacy more monstrous than any deformity the Habsburg line had ever borne. The days that followed were filled with careful deliberation. Matthias, Kruger, and Leopold convened in secret chambers of the palace, reviewing every sketch, every photograph, every note they had taken from the crypt. The wax figures, the mechanized infants, and the preserved specimens were all catalogued meticulously. But the most important task was the story they would tell. Matthias leaned back, rubbing his temples. We cannot simply report this as a medical curiosity. It is far more than that. It is a chronicle of obsession, secrecy, and the extremes to which a dynasty will go to preserve its image. Kruger nodded. Agreed. The automata, the wax models, the jars, they are all symbols. Symbols of power, control, and fear. Roth designed them to endure, to speak across centuries. Our responsibility is to ensure that the lesson is not lost. while keeping the most dangerous details hidden. Leopold's gaze lingered on a photograph of one of the wax infants, its twisted limbs captured in frozen motion. And yet, there is something almost alive in these figures. Even in stillness, they demand attention. They remind us that history is not inert. It moves, even when hidden. Matthias nodded slowly. That is the truth we carry. Not just the facts of what we saw, but the meaning behind them. The dynasty's obsession, Roth's ingenuity, the silence preserved in stone and wax. They all speak of consequences, Kruger added quietly. And the consequences are timeless. The Crypt shows us that power, unchecked and secret, can distort the human mind and body. It creates archives of horror in the name of perfection. Leopold exhaled. We leave this knowledge with the Emperor, carefully. He must understand both the scientific significance and the moral warning. But the wider world, they cannot see it. Some secrets, once revealed, cannot be contained. Matthias nodded. Yes, this is the burden of those who witness history directly. We record, we preserve, and we pass along only what must be known. The rest remains buried, silent, and mechanical. Kruger closed the final journal and set it carefully in the cabinet. The Crypt has spoken. Its message is clear. Obsession, secrecy, and the pursuit of control can outlast generations, preserved in stone, wax, and metal. We must respect that, even as we learn from it. As they prepared to leave, Matthias paused. One last thought. The automata, the mechanisms, the wax figures, they are reminders that the past is never truly gone. It waits, silent, hidden, and when discovered it speaks with a power all its own. Leopold glanced back at the photographs and sketches. Then let us ensure that when it speaks it teaches, not terrorizes. That is our duty as witnesses. Kruger nodded solemnly. Agreed. Let history remember the lessons but not the horror in its rawest form. Let the Crypt remain, as it always has, a silent guardian of secrets. The three men left the palace quietly, each carrying the weight of what they had uncovered. Vienna at night was serene, unaware of the centuries-old secrets hidden beneath its streets. The moonlight glinted off the gilded roofs of the Hofburg, oblivious to the Crypt below, where wax and glass, metal and stone continued their eternal vigil. Deep underground, the nursery waited. The wax heads remained poised, the automata still, and the jars undisturbed. Springs and gears rested in perfect silence. Roth's meticulous planning had endured, the Crypt remaining as it had for centuries, a testament to obsession, secrecy, and the fragility of life. Matthias turned to his companions. We have seen what few ever will. We have borne witness to centuries of hidden truth. Let us carry it carefully, and let the world remain, for the most part, unaware. Leopold and Kruger nodded. Agreed, they murmured in unison. As the three men walked into the quiet streets of Vienna, the Crypt below remained untouched, its secrets preserved. The wax figures, the mechanized heads, and the preserved specimens continued their silent vigil. History, in all its complexity and shadow, had spoken, and would continue to speak, for centuries to come. And in that darkness, where centuries-old gears waited and wax eyes reflected unseen, light, the Habsburg secret endured, timeless, monstrous, hidden. The lesson was clear. Some obsessions, some secrets, are never truly buried.